Our first Golden Shadow events have been posted to the website, goldenshadow.org. On April 10th is our first monthly Mythos workshop, exploring the labors of Hercules. On April 8th, Meme Analysis and Spear of Fire Tarot will be coming to discuss the Fool Tarot card.
On May 23rd, Cadell Lass will be coming to discuss the rift between Freud and Jung. And on July 10th, Dr. Murray Stein will be coming to speak with us about the history of Jungian thought and its current resurgence in popularity. Also, we will be hosting weekly conversations on the Clubhouse app for anyone and everyone who'd like to come to talk to us, every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Pacific.
All of this and more can be found on the website, www.goldenshadow.org.
Welcome to the Golden Shadow. My name is Alyssa Polizzi.
And I'm Arran Rogerson.
Today we're exploring the concept of confession from the standpoint of its religious and cultural traditions, as well as its psychological implications. Now, there are 4 stages of traditional Jungian analysis that are often spoke of. To my understanding, this is not a rigid structure that all analysts follow, but is rather an exploration in the different dynamics that seem to emerge in both the analytic encounter and also within deep personal relationships. The stages are confession, elucidation, education, and transformation. And the question that really emerged in my mind is, why is confession a cornerstone of the therapeutic relationship? Why do we see forms of confession woven through various religious traditions? To me, it seems like it's ultimately an archetypal consideration. That is to say, it's universal to humankind to engage in confession.
So what we're really talking about here is making the implicit or the secret explicit, which is not much different than integrating the shadow in some sense. So all of us have secrets. Some of those are really serious, dark secrets maybe, but more sort of, more generally, we all are keeping things under the surface. And that might even be something simple like we're getting kind of annoyed at our romantic partner, but we're not going to say anything because it's too much trouble to get into an argument right now. We're always doing things like this. And there's things you don't tell strangers. You keep certain boundaries up between you and strangers naturally because it doesn't make sense to get intimate with everyone you encounter. So it's not just about these like really dark things we're all keeping under the surface, but part of living, part of being human, and part of being social especially is we do keep things suppressed. We do keep things under the surface. We're not just dropping truth bombs on everyone around us all the time because you can't really function that way. So confession, you can understand confession as an important part of releasing that tension that we all carry, that burden we have of keeping secrets, that burden we have of keeping things suppressed and under the surface. And confession can really be thought of as this ritual of relieving that pressure. And how might you do that ritual in a way that is balanced, helpful, therapeutic, and safe, as opposed to confessing in a way that is volatile or unsafe or not in a proper container. And so that's really what we're talking about today.
Yeah, I like that you brought that up. The container, I think, is extremely important both to the Jungian approach, but also to the more religious tradition approach, because there's a sense that you're entering into some sort of vessel, some sort of contained environment where you can turn towards that shadow material, something you know that's been there, but you haven't fully addressed or fully opened up to. And this environment is hopefully safe enough for you to really let that go, to let it out, and for it to be received. I think that's another big part of it, both with a therapist, but also with a priest as an example, that you can speak out loud these kind of sins, that dark shadow material, and you're not going to just be rejected. It isn't going to just be thrown back in your face. You're not going to be punished for it. In fact, someone's going to receive it, hold that for you, and then you get to work with it. So that initial stage of confession, especially in the therapeutic standpoint to me, it makes so much sense because you come into the therapeutic relationship with so much weight built upon your shoulders. And there needs to be that kind of initial element of releasing and letting go and speaking out into the world those, I don't know, those secrets, as you said, that have been kept under wraps.
Yeah, so I'm operating from a place of ignorance when it comes to Jungian analysis in this regard. So these are 4 stages of Jungian analysis, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So what's a good example or a good illustration of how confession might look in this therapeutic setting of Jungian analysis?
I think it's about disclosure of information to the analyst directly. And obviously this is not just only happening in the analytic relationship between the analysis process. It's for anyone going into therapy, seeing any kind of therapist, there's that kind of initial point, those first few sessions where you get to start to talk about what's going on in your life. So it's going to be like, I cheated on my spouse and it's caused all of this upheaval. No one else knows about this. I need to be able to work it out with you in this safe space because I can't talk to my sister. Or I can't talk to my father about it. There's something really interesting that happens with the kind of therapeutic space, the analytic relationship, where you can speak those really dark sort of sinful elements into the environment, and someone isn't going to judge you for it. So coming into the analytic space and addressing what it is that's brought you here, what are the complexes that seem to be ruling you? What is the shadow material that you've been running from? I think it's also important to remember that there's no, I don't know, these stages don't actually unfold one after the other. There's like a constant cyclical nature of realizing you have something to confess or something coming through later on, or maybe feeling more comfortable to address something that you didn't feel comfortable about in the early elements of the therapeutic relationship. So it's about owning your material, that inner psychic material, and then bringing it forward so it can be worked on.
Yeah, that last part you just said, you could understand it, I think, as the same way we sort of think about transformation or growth or individuation or the hero's journey. All these things sort of wrapped around sort of this idea that there's a kind of process you can go through that leads to growth. It leads to some sort of achievement in some way, but it's not linear all the time.
Right.
Like the sort of heroic cycle of traveling into the dark place, into the unconscious, and traveling back out. I'm pretty sure we've talked about this before on the podcast, but there's really cycles nested within cycles, nested within cycles. So the hero's journey, your transformative process isn't necessarily linear. You might find yourself going back to previous steps, or maybe you do a little cycle and then you do 10 little cycles, and that's actually one big cycle in itself. So you could see how the 4 stages of Jungian analysis, you can see them as kind of being cyclical, but not always linear all the way through. That you might go to the transformation part and then find that you're actually returning to the confession part, or every session has some element of confession that's built into it, and every session itself is a cycle.
Right.
But I think like what we're tapping into, some other thoughts about what you just said, is the need for confession.
Yes.
I mean, when we talk about therapy, people are going to therapists and they need to confess things.
Yeah.
And it's often a situation where it's like, I can't talk to anyone about this. And that's weird, right?
Yes. So weird.
Right. It's kind of like, we accept that, we take that for granted. It's like, that's the way things are. You can't talk to your friends and family about these things. You have to go find a therapist. Yeah. And it's pretty strange, actually. And it not only illustrates what therapy kind of is, but it also illustrates how much we are keeping secrets from each other all the time. All of our relationships, there's shadow material, right? Because that's really what it is. There's a relational shadow that you have with everyone you know, and you can't talk about everything with them. And there's ways that you're hurting, there's ways that you are confused or struggling, and you can't let that stuff out because you can't let people see your weakness, or you don't want people to know that you're struggling because maybe you don't want to cause them any trouble or distract them from their own stuff. a lot of people can just feel really self-conscious about appearing weak or needing to ask for help. So we keep secrets from each other. So this need for confession is something that is really universal that we all have. I think it's, you know, it's part of our culture. It's part of like modern society. It's like really makes it that we need to have a persona. It's very tough to just be yourself all the time. You can't always do that. And so the need for confession really speaks to this dynamic.
Yeah.
We need to confess.
Yeah.
But who can we go to confess to?
Right.
What can we do about it? Is it always going to be a therapist? Are there other forms of confession that besides this, the dyad? Could there be group confession like Alcoholics Anonymous? Could there be kind of a confession to the world or to God in some sense? So you can see all these different patterns playing out of how do I relieve myself of this shadow material that is bottled up inside of me and festering and making me feel so unstable and volatile and anxious.
Yes. Okay. I have a couple of thoughts. First one is, so the confessional stage is something that I think can be done in all of these different forms and isn't necessarily about doing something with it, like taking the material and starting to work with it. That's the other stages, like elucidation. Okay, let's start to interpret it. Let's put all the pieces together. What are the patterns? Like, what are the archetypal threads that are flowing through this? And then you might then move to the education stage, which is like putting it into practice, building some new habits, all that stuff. And those two middle stages, especially, I think, is where a professional, a therapist, an analyst really comes in and their expertise shines forth and they can guide you through that process so it eventually leads to transformation. But the confessional stage can be done in a group setting in Alcoholics Anonymous, or it can be done as you're walking, you know, in the middle of the woods on a hike, and you're just speaking something out loud that you've been holding back. I was listening to Murray Stein, Jungian analyst Murray Stein, talk about the stages, and he said you could confess to a rock. It doesn't matter. The fact of the what you're tapping into ultimately is that element of these kind of threads of shadow that exist within you that have been blocked up, where there have been a kind of damming, and you're releasing it finally. And so you can experience that cathartic element by speaking to a wall and finally just doing it, letting it go. But there is something particularly important about having that container feel safe and approachable, which often does come with more of a structure, I'd say, like Catholic confession or the therapeutic confession. But it's that initial stage ultimately is about trusting in yourself to go there in yourself, and then having something else to kind of throw it against, to mirror back to you what you've just said, to not condemn you and punish you. Although, you know, maybe we'll get into the religious side of things and how that plays out. But ultimately, that stage is really about the personal experience of allowing the shadow material to flow from you. And that can take so many different forms.
Right. Externalization.
Right.
I refer to this over and over again in our episodes, but externalization is really useful for all kinds of reasons. I mean, there's just the practicality of externalizing what's going on inside, making the inside outside, or taking the implicit and making it explicit. Like if you journal, journaling is useful for many reasons. But I mean, you know, one reason is you can actually just read over what you wrote. You've externalized it, so you're looking at it sort of objectively. You're taking your inside, which is like really subjective. It's just experienced, and you're making it something that's external that can be looked at as an object and saying, wow, I wrote that. I'm like really fucked up. Like, holy shit. Like I didn't realize like how messed up I am, because inside it's so easy for me to ignore the feelings as being something that's worrisome. Now that it's outside, like, oh my God, like what if someone else read this? And that can really give you some insight. But there's also just the embodied ritual of externalization, which isn't just like this rational recognition of what's going on inside you because you're looking at it as an object. But the ritual, as we've talked about in a previous episode titled Ritual, it is something that the body is doing, something that the body recognizes. So the same way that if you've experienced a loss, someone's died that you love, it's really important that you kind of embody some sort of ritual where like you mourn them, you let yourself cry, you go to the pain and you let it happen in your body, as opposed to trying to suppress it and say, I'm too strong to feel any pain, or like, I don't want to go there because it's too difficult. It just stays bottled up inside you. And so you can see that confession is this externalization, but it's also an embodied thing that your body just needs to go through the process.
Yeah.
Crying is embodied. Talking to someone about your problems is very embodied because we're such social creatures. But even if you go and confess to a rock, there's actually sort of a deep, unconscious, embodied ritual that's going on where you're sort of like, bleh, like you're like almost like gushing out this like poison inside you, and the body knows how to do that because it's been doing it for billions of years evolutionarily. Billions it's a strong word. Let's say millions of years. And so that's important to understand. It's not just like rational recognition of like, I did something wrong. It's like, no, the ritual of it is deeper than that, more important than that.
Yeah. So the goal here really is to recognize that by going through this process, consciousness strengthens. Like the ego kind of learns to hold more of that tension because naturally we deny the shadow, we disown it. So we're living in this really one-sided way where things that have happened to us, things that we've done, elements that have been at play in the environment are influencing us, but it's more in the shadow. And when we don't have that face-to-face relationship with it, we ultimately act out those elements of the shadow. But the shadow is the puppet master. We're just, being taken along for the ride. And the confessional aspect allows us to strengthen consciousness because when we recognize that shadow material, we can choose to work with it or we can choose to enact it rather than acting it out unconsciously. And there's just that really important initial stage of admitting that to yourself and embodying the shadow and allowing it to kind of flow through you. But that sort of quickly needs to be supported by recognizing that confessional alone won't change everything. There are more stages to the elements of integration and transformation. And I think that's why the Jungian analysis stages are quite compelling because it's in some ways mapping out, at least from Jung's point of view, what those important cornerstones are for getting from the beginning of point A of a lot of suffering to that space of transformation. And that ultimately does require us to enter into relationship with others or to be within a contained dyad to do something with that confessional material. And you do see that kind of at play in the ways that confession manifests in culture and society. So we see it in the therapeutic relationship. We see it also in religious settings. And I think that what was interesting, kind of coming from a pretty traditional Catholic background, I was like, yeah, like the Catholics are the only ones who confess, right?
Yeah.
But actually, upon further research, all of these different spiritual traditions have versions of it.
Right. I mean, that's the stereotype is the Catholic confession, right?
Yeah.
Where you go into the, I don't even know what the proper name is for it, but you go inside the box.
Right.
Which I'm not sure what it's called. I think there's a proper name
there probably
for
is.
sort of
I don't know.
the booth you go in,
Yeah.
essentially, and a priest sits on the other side,
Yeah.
behind some sort of perforated wall, so you guys can talk, but you don't see each other. And then someone says, like, "Father, I have a confession to make.
Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned."
Yeah, I killed 5 people like this week or something like that. It's like that's like in the movies, it's always kind of like this like really like climactic sort of over the top thing.
Yeah.
But that is the stereotype is the Catholic Church.
Right.
And so we're familiar with that stereotype, but we also, I would say probably, we didn't do extensive research on this, but I would say probably universally there is some form of ritualistic confession, probably in every culture. And the reason for that is probably because it's actually really useful and it's really practical and it's healthy.
Yes.
You could even see it as keeping a group of people healthy, keeping a tribe healthy, some sort of ritualistic confession. Is everyone telling the truth? Did anyone do anything wrong? Did you do something wrong? Confess it. We'll talk about it. We'll forgive you. And then we're good. And then we move on, right? So you see it in Buddhism. I think Buddhism, just as a philosophy or practice, is really grounded in sort of renunciation and self-denial. And I think part of the whole practice of Buddhism, and different lineages might emphasize this more than others, is sort of confessing these ways in which you have done wrong to others, or maybe how you've lived wrong, or maybe ways in which you've had bad thoughts or something like that. It's part of like the monastic tradition. Is really grounded in this idea of letting go, of giving up a lot of these sort of earthly things that are often so associated with like sin and bad deeds. But more than just Catholicism, Islam has confession. I think it's more of a confession to Allah or God, more so than it is to some sort of religious authority or to another person.
Yeah, to like an intermediary.
Right. And as we already discussed, you can still do this ritualistic confession to someone other than another person who's listening, and the process is still there. There's still kind of like the embodied ritual of it. And when you're confessing to this higher entity, this higher principle, you're really submitting yourself to a higher judgment than just like your romantic partner who judges you and says like, you're like annoying me. Like confessing to God really is sort of this more intense, probably more sincere form of confession, where it's like really like God sees all and God has these rules that you should abide by. And you can see how powerful that would be to have a regular confession to God who's like, I know that you see everything. And so there's that kind of transparency that you're already approaching it with, which is like, I can't keep anything secret from you. I need to confess all these things I've done badly, and I need to confess all of it because you can see everything and you can understand how powerful that would be.
Yeah, so there's this really strong connection with forgiveness and also with authority, I think, around confession, even when it's taken down to that level between like romantic partners. It's like in some ways your romantic partner has like an authority over your emotional state. Like they have power there. They can wield a powerful sword that can liberate you, but it can also cut you. Yeah. So when we speak those words out, when we're looking for cathartic relief, we are looking for someone to acknowledge what we've said, to give us a sense of acknowledgement and forgiveness, but also that there's a meaningful exchange, that there's some sort of authoritative power or some sort of like stronger archetypal dynamic at play. Because when we're confessing to the priest, which is really like that intermediary of God, we're speaking to the highest principle. We're speaking about our soul. We're looking for rejuvenation. We're looking to experience a type of like a purity brought back to the spirit, because we're feeling darkened. We're feeling like the dark tendrils of the shadow just wavering through us, and how it's clouded our life. And being able to speak to some individual through that cathartic confessional process allows you to separate from shadow and contain it. And then the unacceptable somehow becomes acceptable. That which you had been denying can now be set forth in front of you to be grappled with. And that, to me, is like the requirement of individuation. You need to be able to work with unconscious material. And this facilitates that process. It really allows you to gain awareness, and then with that awareness to be kind of guided forth through a process of development. In the Catholic traditions, you have some sort of penance that you're doing. You're going to say 5 Hail Marys or something like that. But even that is a ritual practice to sit with your shadow material and then to walk away and let go of it, to not have it constantly hovering around you, bearing down upon you, just lowering your sense of self. Instead, you say your prayers, you maybe speak to God, and you feel refreshed, and you can move forward with that process.
Yeah, and you can start to see how confession with these religious traditions gets tied in with the idea of sin.
Yeah.
Right? And you can see this being played with universally, sort of the notion of judgment, the the notion of bad deeds versus good deeds, and that you're sort of accumulating bad deeds over time. You're getting this list of all these bad things you've done, and once you die, that you're going to be judged somehow. So like there is sort of like this stereotypical idea of like lining up at like the gate of heaven, and like someone's like checking like, what's your name? Like, and they're like, okay, oh, we have like this list of all the things you've done in your life. Wow, you did a lot of really bad things. So like we pull this lever and like you go down to hell. That's a stereotype, but it's still like this image that I think is pretty prominent in our culture of being judged when you die. And you can see this in Christianity, definitely, with the notions of heaven and hell, and the way that sin is associated with going to hell, and virtue is associated with going to heaven. But also like in Hinduism, in these notions of karma, that you can accumulate bad karma throughout your life, and that's actually going to come back to haunt you or haunt a future you in your next life. And so this notion of cosmic justice is like this universal idea across cultures. Cosmic justice, the universe or God or nature or reality, what have you, is going to judge you for the way that you've behaved. And so part of the idea behind confession is that you accumulate sin over time, but that somehow confessing that sin actually absolves you of the sin. So as you acquire this list of bad things you've done, you confess, and those sins kind of get crossed off the list. It's sort of the most like, literal interpretation of what's happening, but you can see that being played with karma and with Christianity and heaven and hell.
Yeah. Well, in the Christian traditions, we believe that like man is born sinful. And I think that's something that can feel really unfair and oppressive to people. But if we take a psychological point of view and we're looking at sin as that carrying of shadow material, to me, it represents that we will always generate shadow content within us. We are these sinful creatures, but we also have a redemptive arc. We can come into relationship with it. We can have a relationship with God, which you can think of more as these higher moral principles, better ways of being. And through that process, you can live a good life that benefits you, that benefits your family, that benefits your community. The whole society tends to thrive, but we have to recognize that kind of internal darkness that we all have. We all have a shadow. We will all always continue to generate shadow material, and you will never be fully integrated. Like there's no one who actually doesn't have a shadow. And if someone says that, I think they don't exactly know what they're talking about.
Right.
But
we've heard that claimed a few times. So like my shadow is fully integrated.
Yeah.
Okay.
But no. Ultimately, it's part of our nature, and we wouldn't be truly whole if we didn't have the ability to keep dipping into the darkness of the psyche. So our sinful nature, that shadow generating property of our being, ultimately gives us all these new challenges that help us grow. Because to me, like shadow material is really where like the juicy stuff is. That's where personality transformation really comes into play. And we can see it through those religious traditions, as you were saying. This is how we map that out in ancient times. And we saw it then, and we can't forget about it now either.
Right. I mean, an important way to understand sin as a concept, it's kind of been trivialized and sort of mocked, I feel like, in our culture quite a bit. But sin is a given. That's supposed to be understood as far as sin goes. It's not just like, oh, you've sinned, you go to hell, like, bye. It's like, that's never been the concept of sin. Sin is sort of a given. You are going to sin. You might even sin daily, and that might be a given because life is difficult. You're going to miss your mark. You're going to fall off the path. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to succumb to temptation. Everyone's going to do that. And so sin is a given. And that's why confession is so important. The idea that like, well, no one ever needs to confess if they don't do anything wrong is idealistic and silly. It's like everyone needs to confess because everyone's going to do wrong things all the time. Everyone's going to sin. And that's why the practice of confession is so important, is because it is, and you can see it because it's being carried out in all these different traditions universally, you can see that confession is actually adaptive.
Yes.
It's evolutionarily advantageous, you could say, for people to confess, for groups of people to confess to each other. And it makes perfect sense. You can see that the shadow is real.
Yeah.
Humans have shadow. And you can see that it's actually really advantageous in this sort of like, calculated functional way, if you want to think about it. Like, it's very advantageous if you integrate shadow regularly.
Yeah.
If you take what's buried within you and you bring light to it and you put it out there and you say, hey, my friend, I did you wrong and I'm sorry. Will you forgive me? It's like that actually keeps the relationship healthy. So there's no superstition associated with that. It's all totally concrete. And you can see it everywhere. You can see it in relationships. Confession, bringing things to light, actually helps everything and everyone if done properly. Of course, there's always ways confession could throw things for a crazy loop if it's really extreme confession. But that's something that's important to understand here is how adaptive it is, and that's why it's adopted by these religions, adopted by the cultures, is because it's like actually like this is a smart, advantageous thing to do.
Yeah. I think that adaptive evolutionary quality that you're talking about is highlighted really well in mythology and our stories, obviously, where we play out the kind of internal drama of our being. So maybe we'll look at a few examples and kind of explore how we look at confession through mythology. So we were talking a lot about cosmic justice, and you see that not only in the Christian tradition, but from the Egyptian mythological point of view. Ma'at, who is the goddess of truth and justice and harmony and divine order, one of her primary roles in the Egyptian religion dealt with weighing of the heart of the deceased person. And, her feather was the measure that determined whether the souls could go to paradise or to the afterlife or not. So you have that similar kind of Christian symbol there of kind of coming to the gates of heaven and are you allowed in or not? But what you see really interestingly in Egyptian burial rites is that each person would be buried with all these different items that kind of prepare them for death. And there's something called the negative confessions, usually within the Book of the Dead. And it's a list of all of these different sins, like 42 sins, which the soul of the deceased can honestly say they've never committed. So when it stands at the gates of Ma'at and judgment comes upon them, they've already gotten written out. I did not. So it's like it's like confession turned on its head. But within that also you saw that depending on the person themselves, they would also fess up to misdeeds or mistakes that they did make. So there's kind of a marking of the words of absolution based on their sins, quote unquote, and that prepared them to move into the afterlife. So you see that playing out in the burial rites, both at the recognition of the ways that you've lived in harmony with that principle of divine order, and also the ways that you've fallen short and how you've made up for it.
Yeah, so same pattern, right? Cosmic justice, heaven's gate, the judgment that comes upon you. It's funny, we moved from religion to mythology, but really we just moved from religion to religion, essentially, or mythology to mythology. And where do you draw the line between what's religion and what's mythology is kind of
it's
interesting.
Blurry.
Right, because Greek mythology is mythology, even though it was Greek religion, essentially.
Yes. So another interesting story I think to look at is Judas. And I think we see the principle of the confessional coming forward after Judas gives Jesus up and he starts to feel all this regret. He returns to confess what he has done wrong. And there's kind of different versions where some people kind of hear what he has to say. Some people kind of still pushing him out, but ultimately being this betrayer, the betrayal of the holiest principle that you could possibly cross, ultimately his confessional leads to his death. And I think in some versions he usually hangs himself, but ultimately there's this recognition of when you cross this kind of really deep internal principle especially connected to something as deeply archetypal as Jesus, that there's going to be this sudden compulsion to need to confess, that you can't even carry something that heavy. But does that ultimately lead to the removal of your guilt? In this case, not really.
Yeah, I mean the drive to confess is something we keep sort of touching upon. Is that like it is like a pressure cooker, right? These things that you've done, or these secrets that you're keeping, or this real you, even you might say, that's kept under the surface. It's really wanting to explode outward,
Yeah.
and it can't because of various constraints that you've put on yourself, or maybe that people put on you. But with Judas, he is overcome with his own morality. And that's what's happening with the confession. Is like, I cannot hold this inside of me. Like, this is so wrong. I need to make it right. And how do I make things right? I say them out loud. I say what I really did. I say what happened. I let the world know who I really am, or what I've really done. And after I've done that, even if now everyone knows and they see what a horrible person I am, or what a criminal I am, there is still kind of this relief of like, okay, well, everyone knows, like, it's not a secret anymore. I can move on now.
Yeah, in this case, with his death being also looking at it from that mythological and symbolic view, like the death is a symbolic of psychic death. That's a transformation, and he does it by his own hand after the confessional.
Yeah, I guess that kind of brings up the idea of the hangman card for me.
Yeah.
Preceding the death card.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I wouldn't think of Judas as being a transformation, but still, it's the synthesis of all these different memes and ideas and archetypes is always kind of interesting.
So a couple more examples. I wanted to look at the Eros and Psyche story, or Cupid and Psyche. And this is an incredibly famous myth about this individual heroine, Psyche, who is married to Cupid, aka Eros, but doesn't ever know who he is or what he looks like. And there's this kind of agreement between them. She lives in this nice place she's taken care of. He comes every night and they share time together, but she doesn't know what he looks like. And, the story goes on to eventually have her at this very critical moment where she's been sort of pestered by her sisters. And you might say that's kind of analogous to these kind of whispering voices and parts of herself saying, who is it? Like, who is that in the darkness? I must know, despite the agreement. And so she lights a candle and she looks at Cupid and she's overcome with his beauty. She spills candle wax, she burns him, and he flies off and leaves her behind. And there's this deep dread of having not only hurt the individual that she loved, but there's a violation of trust. It's Psyche's sin that she broke the agreement. And she goes on then on this kind of heroine's quest to absolve herself of this sin by going through all these different trials that are given to her from Aphrodite, Cupid's mother. And you see her move through all these different stages, having to absolve herself of what has happened by answering to that principle of the goddess, by recognizing her wrongdoings. And eventually this does lead to Cupid and Psyche coming back together. And then she's sort of lifted up into sacredness. She becomes a goddess. She eats, the fruit of the ambrosia. She's allowed to really marry Cupid in an official way and live on Olympus. And so you see this very interesting arc of her purity and her innocence, and then the sin, and needing to kind of move through an embodied confessional that eventually gets her back into right relationship and transformed into something much higher.
Right. So again, this absolution of something bad that you've done, and the idea that that's possible. After you've sinned, after you've carried out these bad deeds, that's not the end. You still have the opportunity to make things right. And so you can understand how mythologically this would be an important theme to explore, is the possibility of making things right.
Yeah.
you've done something bad, you've fallen off the path, you can still get back on the path, and you can make up for it by doing such a positive deed that it cancels out the negative deed. And again, that's not just like in God's eyes or just like this superstitious mumbo jumbo. You can see that just in everyday life that you can make mistakes, but it's not the end of the world once you make a mistake. And if you just interpret your life that way, of like, oh, well, I lost my job, I guess I will never have a job again, and I'm not cut out for working. It's like, that's a ridiculous mindset, and we all know that. There's no secret there. It's like, no, you can make up for this. Work really hard, change your patterns, condition yourself to be a better person, go ask for forgiveness from all the people that you hurt, and it actually does bring things back to a balance that is a virtuous balance, and that's real, that's concrete, and the mythology dramatizes that.
So one last consideration. What happens when we don't confess our sins, when we allow them to grow darker and more shadowy, and they really start to fester? The tale that came to mind was Guinevere and Lancelot, who are having an affair. And of course, Guinevere is the queen of King Arthur, and Lancelot is one of his most prominent knights of the Round Table. And they fall in love. And, you know, it's very much that kind of story of feeling so caught up in these deep, powerful emotions. And there's lots of different versions of different adventures where Lancelot is the one who goes out and saves Guinevere because she was captured. It wasn't Arthur. So there's this real sense of depth of connection that they have. But ultimately, Guinevere is married to Arthur, and they begin this romantic relationship that, when left in the darkness and left in the shadow, festers in such a way that when it comes out, it's like an explosion, and it's revealed because someone else reveals it. And that causes Arthur and Lancelot to become these warring kind of factions against each other, and war breaks out, and Arthur's throne is in jeopardy. And in some versions, this does lead to the death of Arthur, which is that the principle of the king who's running that ordered nature of the land, of keeping everything in place for the individuals, but something within that psychic landscape within the kingdom was festering that whole time. And that element of not confessing and not bringing it forward made it so that when it really did finally break into the surface of consciousness, it wreaked havoc. It destroyed everything in its way.
Right. So this is a pattern that we've talked about a lot, is the kind of bottling up of shadow material, and that the integration of shadow material is something you do gradually, slowly. And as you do that, you process it, and you process it in a safe, controlled way, and you're able to grow and develop because of that. Whereas instead, if you just bottle up shadow material and it just builds and builds and builds and builds, eventually it does explode outward, and it does so in inopportune times, in inappropriate ways. If you don't vent your aggression and angst, and you just pretend everything's fine, you might find yourself set off at one moment and you just lose control, and you might lose control violently. Or maybe you get drunk and you lose control violently. I'm obviously speaking from a masculine viewpoint, but you can see this in relationships, romantic relationships especially, is if you're not talking about what's going on, if you're keeping secrets from each other, and you just keep not talking, if the secrets just build up over and over and over and over, over time, something's going to happen, and your relationship is just going to end. It's going to be so explosive and damaging that you can't possibly pick up the pieces. And so it's important to little piece by piece, little drop by drop, to integrate that shadow. And you can see this almost like as a metaphysical property, because like when we're talking about like the flood, for instance, right? The flood is sort of this idea, is like, if you're not prepared for something bad to go wrong, if you're not sort of like making sure that everything's in order all the time, when something finally does go wrong, it destroys everything, and it's catastrophic. So it's important to anticipate that the flood is coming. It's important to be responsible. It's important to do your maintenance. So when the flood comes, you're prepared, and it doesn't just destroy your entire life. And so we can see this again playing out in mythology over and over again, is the importance of the gradual piece by piece of integrating the shadow,
Yeah.
making those contents known, shining a light on the darkness, a little bit at a time to keep it at bay.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Arran, you got any modern examples for us?
Right. So it's my turn now. Arran's pop culture references. Okay, so this ties into Guinevere and Lancelot actually, but like Game of Thrones, right? Mm-hmm. Game of Thrones is so rich, and I feel like we'll keep bringing up Game of Thrones. Spoiler alert.
Spoiler.
Spoiler alert. But Game of Thrones it's such a rich universe, and there's so many characters, but a huge part of the Game of Thrones plot line is secrets,
Yeah.
right? They're really useful plot devices, but and so they're used a lot. But it's a very good illustration of the power of a secret to rip apart the entire world. And so Jamie and Cersei have a secret, and they're trying really, really hard to make sure that no one finds out.
Yeah.
And they kind of have to.
Right.
It's not like, oh, just integrate that shadow. It's like, no, they'll be executed if they do.
Yeah.
But they keep the secret, and there's all these opportunities for the secret to get out, for people to find out, and people are finding out.
Right.
And so they're doing everything they can to make sure that no one finds out. Bran gets pushed out the window because of this secret. This starts off this huge war.
Yeah.
The Starks go to war with the Lannisters, and the country is torn apart because of these secrets. Jon, there's a secret kept. He's actually the heir to the throne, but for most of the series, it's portrayed that he is just some low bastard child, and this secret is such a prominent thing that's kept under wraps, and it destroys Ned's life.
Yeah.
He dies for it.
Right.
It messes up his marriage with Catelyn. This sort of secret that Jon is actually supposed to be king. Catelyn thinks that Ned has cheated on her and had this child with a prostitute.
Right.
And
The
so
honorable Ned Stark. The
Right.
virtuous Ned Stark who never sins.
Right, so he keeps the secret, and it kind of tears apart their relationship. It kind of tears apart the family in certain ways.
Yeah.
So that's a mythological playing with the idea of like confession will keep the world from blowing up, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such an interesting mirror of the Guinevere and Lancelot story. Just like total destruction and war that comes from it. But at the same time, how could you have admitted to it? It was always going to be bad.
These are also some like really random. These are just like came off the top of my head. That this isn't very like what would you say structured or consistent. So I'm going to move to this movie, Almost Famous, and there's a scene in Almost Famous where the band, which is like the main characters of the movie, they're on a plane and they think the plane's going to crash, and because they think that everyone's going to die, they all just start randomly confessing things. Like they just start saying like, okay, Johnny, like, I'm sorry, like, I slept with your wife, like, twice. And he's like, oh, you bastard, like, why did you do that? And, you know, one of the other band members, I can't really remember, but just, like, confesses, like, oh, like, that was me that, like, stole your guitar and threw it in the dumpster. That's not actually what happened. I can't remember that. And then, like, one guy's, like, confesses, like, okay, like, I'm gay.
Right. So he screams it out.
Yeah, he screams it out. But then the plane settles and they all survive. But it's like, well, it's funny, and it also like makes sense that maybe that would actually happen.
Yeah.
And you know, the question is why? It's like because everyone's holding on to these secrets.
Yeah.
Everyone actually wants to confess, and if they could confess without any consequences, they would.
Yeah.
And so if everyone's about to die, there are no consequences anymore. And so everyone just starts confessing. They keep on saying all these things that I've done in my life, all these things that you don't know about, all these secrets I've kept from you. It feels so relieving to do this.
Yeah.
And to do so before I die, to do so before I get judged by God, to do so before I arrive at that heaven's gate, that cosmic justice.
Yeah, there's some sort of like inner law that takes over, like this archetypal principle that's connected to that divine justice, the divine order. We know we're going to be judged in some ways. It's a way to look at it. But ultimately, like we need to go through this process of coming to terms with our own material so we can move into that kind of next transition.
A similar one is Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. At the end of the movie, spoiler alert, Li Mubai, who is like the great swordsman and one of the main characters, he's poisoned and he's dying and he knows he's going to die. And like with his last few breaths, he confesses his love for Yu Shulian, who is another one of the main characters. And they've been in love with each other their entire lives, but they could never confess it to each other because of honor, essentially, because the woman's husband was Limubaya's brother or something like that. And it would be dishonorable for them to actually come together after that. So because there's no consequences, he has this deep secret. He has this thing that he cannot say out loud, and it's been burdening him his entire life. And then once the consequences disappear because he's about to die, he confesses. And that's the one last thing he wants to do before he dies, before he, again, arrives at this gate of heaven almost and gets judged. Okay, last one. In The Matrix, Cypher, he betrays everyone.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, I guess we should probably just stop saying that. But seriously, we're always going to be ruining these movies for you. But he's about to betray everyone and kill everyone.
Yeah.
And he does kill a few people. And the entire time he's confessing what he's done. And that's like partly like a plot device. Like, let's tell you the plot. Like, audience, here's the plot. But it is also illustrating this secret that he has. And it feels so good to him to confess as he's murdering his supposed friends and crewmates. And he confesses that he's betrayed Morpheus, and that he would love to see Morpheus's face as he knows, as he finds out that Cypher was the one who betrayed him, and he confesses his love for Trinity before he is about to kill her. And he's getting that satisfaction, that deep satisfaction of wetting out that shadow and saying, "It was me all along, ha, 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 ha." Like, he wouldn't have to say anything. He could just kill them.
Yeah.
But instead, he gets this deep pleasure, this huge relief out of releasing that pressure, that suppressed information, and making it explicit, putting it out into the world.
Yeah. So I think the challenge really is for the everyday individual to consider how to invite confessional into their life. Are there ways to approach it from, I don't know, something that seems manageable and sustainable in your everyday personal relationships, leaning a little bit more into honesty, into that internal truth that kind of allows the ebbing of the shadow to come kind of closer and closer? Is it time to maybe move into a therapeutic or analytic relationship to explore those deep elements of sin and darkness you carry? Is there a spiritual guide or religious elder that can facilitate that experience? Because as we've seen through all these different elements over this episode, is that it's woven in through life in fiction and mythology and religion in the psyche. So we need to facilitate confession. We don't want that to be pushed into the shadow. We want to invite it in and allow ourselves to really ease into the process of shadow work, because it's critical for individuation. It's critical for us to really become whole, is to acknowledge our dark side and to allow it to grow with us.
Yeah, and you can play with this also, like right now. You don't need to necessarily find a therapeutic relationship. You don't need to find the Jungian analyst. You don't even need to talk to anyone else.
Yeah.
You can experiment with this. If there's a secret you have, if there's something that you're keeping under the surface because you don't want anyone to know about it, or you're too embarrassed, or you can't show your weakness, or you can't show who you really are, if you just try saying it out loud to yourself, you are externalizing some of these contents. It's inside of you, and you can have thoughts where you're sort of acknowledging it in your mind, but that's really not the same thing as the embodied speaking, putting it to words. When you externalize it, it makes it real, it makes it concrete, and you might actually find that it can be very powerful just to say out loud that, I'm a weak person, I'm a terrible person, or, I broke the lamp and I didn't tell anyone, I blamed it on the dog or something like that. You could say that out loud, and you'll find that you are, in some sense, relieving this burden that you have, this pressure that you have. You can also, and this might sound strange to some people, but you can also talk to God.
Yeah.
Talk to some being who is sort of a higher abstracted principle, who is still anthropomorphized, but still like who listens to you, but is more than just like a rock or a wall that might be hard to have a conversation with. You can find that if you personify reality, you can actually have a conversation with it. you might find it incredibly therapeutic to be able to unload these secrets. If you find this podcast useful, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/goldenshadow.org.
If you'd like to keep up to date with our projects, attend one of our live events, or work one-on-one with myself or Arran, head to www.goldenshadow.org.
Thanks for listening.
See you later.